The Ashbourne boys hadn't made a sound in 8 months. Not a cry, not a whimper, not a laugh. Just dead. Empty stares from 2 children who had watched their mother bleed out in the wreckage of a crushed carriage. The Duke hired physicians, priests, and strict disciplinarians. Nothing worked. Then came Tilly. She wasn't a miracle worker, just a desperate maid scrubbing the nursery grate. But when she absent-mindedly hummed an old, forgotten tune, the boys finally turned. And the Duke, standing in the shadows of the hallway, froze. Grief, Tilly Warren had long ago decided, was a luxury for the rich. When a poor man died, his widow wept for an hour and then went back to the washboard because the landlord still wanted his rent. When a duchess died, the whole world was expected to stop spinning. Ashbourne Hall had certainly stopped. Tilly stood in the sprawling gravel driveway, her battered leather boots soaking through from the morning drizzle. The estate was a monolithic slab of grey limestone, sitting heavy on the Yorkshire moors like a gravestone. All the curtains in the massive front windows were drawn shut. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress holding something in, or keeping the living out. She hoisted her canvas satchel higher on her shoulder. She was 22, pragmatic to a fault, and down to her last 3 shillings. She didn't care if the Duke of Ashbourne was a grieving madman, as the village gossip claimed, so long as he paid his wages on time and provided a warm bed. The servants' entrance smelled of lye soap, damp wool, and boiling cabbage. Tilly was intercepted by Mrs. Gable, a housekeeper whose spine was so rigid it looked as though she had swallowed an iron poker. Mrs. Gable didn't ask about Tilly's dreams or her character. She checked Tilly's hands for calluses, inspected her fingernails for dirt, and asked if she was prone to hysterics. "No, ma'am, just prone to working," Tilly said. "Good." Mrs. Gable's lips were a thin, bloodless line. "The master tolerates no noise. The carpets are swept, not beaten, while he is in residence. Doors are caught before they latch. You will not speak unless spoken to, and you will not, under any circumstances, attempt to engage the young masters." Tilly blinked. "The young masters?" "Lord Theodore and Lord Edward," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "They are unwell. The nursery is on the 3rd floor. You are to bring up the coal, empty the ashes, and remove their trays. You are not their governess. The last 3 quit because the silence unsettled them. You will clean the grates and leave." Tilly nodded. Coal and ash. She could manage that. Her first week was a blur of aching knees and soot-stained knuckles. Ashbourne Hall was a cold place. The fires were kept low. The servants spoke in hushed murmurs, and the master of the house, Nathaniel, the Duke of Ashbourne, was a ghost. Tilly saw him only once in those first 7 days. A tall, broad-shouldered man in stark black, striding across the grand foyer. His face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, his jaw locked so tight it looked as though the bone might snap. He looked right through her, a man entirely consumed by his own internal purgatory. It wasn't until her 4th day that she truly noticed the boys. Tilly hauled a heavy scuttle of coal up the winding servant stairs to the 3rd floor. She knocked softly on the heavy oak door of the nursery, waited for the curt "enter" from the current, fraying governess, and pushed her way inside. The nursery was a vast, airy room that had been stripped of all joy. The rocking horse sat perfectly still in the corner. The wooden blocks were stacked with mathematical precision. Sitting on the Persian rug were Theodore, 8, and Edward, 6. They wore matching sailor suits, perfectly pressed. They were beautiful children, with dark, unruly hair and pale skin. But there was something fundamentally broken in their posture. They sat completely motionless, watching a fly buzz against the window pane. Tilly knelt by the fireplace, laying out her tools. She kept her eyes down, but she could see them in her periphery. Children were supposed to be loud. They were supposed to squirm, ask incessant questions, and break things. She scraped the cold ash from the grate. The scraping sound was deafening in the dead quiet of the room. Neither boy flinched. Tilly finished laying the new fire and struck a match. The sulphur flared. She blew softly on the kindling, coaxing the flame. When she sat back on her heels, she realized Edward, the younger one, was staring at her. His eyes were wide, dark, and entirely hollow. It was the look of an old soldier who had seen the line break, trapped in the face of a 6-year-old. "Edward!" The governess snapped from her armchair. "Do not stare at the help." Edward didn't blink. He didn't look at the governess. He just kept his dead gaze locked on Tilly's soot-stained hands. Tilly didn't smile at him. She knew better than to offer a fake, pitying smile to someone in pain. She simply wiped her hands on her apron, picked up her empty coal scuttle, and walked out. As she closed the door, the heavy, suffocating silence of the room followed her down the hall, settling deep in her chest. Weeks bled into a month. The routine at Ashbourne Hall was relentless, designed to keep the servants exhausted and the family insulated from the outside world. Tilly's hands grew raw from scrubbing stone floors, but her mind remained sharp. She watched, she listened, and she realized that the silence of the Ashbourne boys wasn't just a symptom of grief. It was a contagion that was slowly infecting the entire house. The governess, a nervous woman named Miss Higgins, resigned in tears by Tilly's 5th week. "I can't do it anymore." Tilly heard her sobbing to Mrs. Gable in the hallway. "They don't cry, they don't laugh. When one of them falls and scrapes a knee, he just bleeds and stares. It's unnatural. It's like watching 2 corpses playing house." Mrs. Gable paid the woman off and sent her packing. Until a replacement could be found from London, the nursery duties were split among the senior staff. But senior staff had little patience for the 3rd floor, which meant the daily maintenance of the boys fell increasingly to Tilly. She didn't mind. The nursery, despite its heavy atmosphere, was warmer than the scullery, and she preferred the silent company of the boys to the biting gossip of the kitchen maids. Tilly learned their habits not through words, but through observation. Theodore, the elder, was a protector. When the door opened too fast, he would subtly shift his weight, placing himself between the doorway and his younger brother. He hoarded small things, a smooth pebble, a bit of dried wax, a stray button, hiding them under his mattress as if preparing for a siege. Edward was a ghost. He barely ate, pushing his mashed peas around his plate until the fat hardened. He spent hours staring out the window at the moors, his small hands pressed flat against the glass. Then there was the Duke. Nathaniel visited the nursery precisely once a day, at 6 o'clock in the evening. Tilly was usually finishing up the grate when the heavy tread of his boots echoed down the corridor. The ritual never varied. The door would open. The Duke would stand on the threshold. The boys would immediately stop whatever they were doing and stand shoulder to shoulder, rigid as soldiers on parade. Nathaniel would look at them. His eyes would trace the lines of their faces, searching, perhaps, for their mother. Catherine had died, pinned beneath the splintered wood of their overturned carriage, shielding Edward with her own body. The boys had sat in the dark, cold mud for 3 hours, next to a cooling corpse before help arrived. The Duke couldn't look at them without seeing her blood. It was written in the tight clench of his jaw, the white-knuckle grip he kept on the brass doorknob. He would stand there for 2 minutes, breathing shallowly, entirely incapable of crossing the room to touch his own sons. Then he would nod curtly. "Good evening, Theodore. Edward." He would turn and leave. The door would click shut, and the boys would return to the floor, slightly more diminished than they had been before. Tilly found herself hating the man. She knew grief was a monster. She had lost her own father to a dockside accident when she was 12, and her mother to consumption 3 years later. She knew what it was like to feel as though the sky was crushing you, but she also knew that you couldn't abandon the living to worship the dead. One bleak Tuesday in November, the silence in the nursery finally broke Tilly's restraint. She was mending a tear in one of the heavy velvet curtains. The boys were sitting on the floor, passing a wooden block back and forth. No words, no smiles. Just the dull clack of wood on wood. The sheer oppressive monotony of it made Tilly's skin crawl. The room felt like a vacuum, sucking the air from her lungs. She didn't consciously decide to make a sound. It simply bubbled up from survival instinct. She began to hum. It was low, barely a vibration in her throat. She didn't hum a proper parlor song or a church hymn. She hummed a rough, working-class melody she'd learned from her mother. A Cornish fisherman's shanty about the changing tide and the dark water. The notes were minor, repetitive, rhythmic. A heavy swaying tune. The tide pulls deep. The water sleeps. She kept her eyes on her needlework, pulling the heavy thread through the velvet. The clack of the wooden block stopped. Tilly paused, her heart giving a sudden sharp thump. She looked over her shoulder. Both boys were staring at her. Theodore had dropped the block. Edward was leaning forward, his small hands gripping the edge of the rug. Their eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were wide, terrified, and painfully alive. Tilly stopped humming immediately. She dropped her gaze, her cheeks burning. She had broken the rules. She was just a maid. "My apologies, my lords," she murmured, gathering her sewing kit. She hurried out of the room, her chest tight. She didn't see Theodore reach out and touch the empty space where she had been sitting. The weather broke 3 days later. A massive, brooding front rolled in from the North Sea, plunging the Yorkshire moors into premature darkness by 3 in the afternoon. By evening, the wind was howling around the limestone corners of Ashbourne Hall like a dying animal, rattling the window panes and sending sudden drafts down the chimneys. Down in the servants' hall, the staff huddled around the massive iron stove, nursing mugs of bitter tea. Tilly sat on an overturned crate, her hands wrapped around her warm cup, listening to the thunder crack overhead. It was a violent, physical sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Them boys will be a mess," muttered Mrs. Cook, stirring a pot of stew. "Storms do 'em no good. Not since the accident." Tilly frowned, looking up at the ceiling. The nursery was on the 3rd floor, directly beneath the slates. "Is someone up there with them?" Mrs. Gable locked him in for the night. A footman replied, uncaring. "Can't do nothing for 'em anyway. They don't cry out, they just sit there and shake. Master's orders are to leave 'em be, says fussing makes it worse." Tilly's grip tightened on her mug. She looked at the heavy oak door leading to the back stairs. The wind shrieked again, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it sounded like timber splitting, like a carriage breaking apart on a dark road. She didn't think about her wages. She didn't think about Mrs. Gable's iron rules. She set her mug down on the table, the ceramic clattering against the wood, and stood up. "I have to check the grates," Tilly lied smoothly. Before anyone could argue, she grabbed a solitary candle and slipped into the stairwell. The climb to the 3rd floor was freezing. The shadows danced erratically on the stone walls, thrown by her flickering candle. When she reached the landing, the sound of the storm was deafening. She unlocked the nursery door and pushed it open. The room was pitch black, the fire having died down to a few glowing embers. A flash of lightning illuminated the space in stark, bone-white relief. The beds were empty. "Theodore? Edward?" Tilly kept her voice low, stepping into the room. Another flash of lightning. She saw a shape huddled in the narrow gap between the heavy oak wardrobe and the wall. Tilly set the candle down on a table and knelt on the floorboards. Theodore was sitting with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. His arms were wrapped fiercely around his younger brother. Edward had his face buried in Theodore's neck. Both of them were trembling so violently their teeth were chattering, but true to their broken nature, they weren't making a single sound. No sobs, no screams, just a silent, suffocating terror. "Oh, you poor little mites," Tilly whispered. The cynicism that usually shielded her heart cracked wide open. She crawled into the dusty space between the wardrobe and the wall. She didn't try to pull them out into the open room. They were hiding for a reason. Instead, she wedged herself in beside them. She didn't ask permission. She reached out and pulled both rigid, shaking boys into her lap. Theodore stiffened, trying to resist, but Tilly's arms were strong from years of hauling coal and scrubbing floors. She gathered them close, pressing their small, cold faces into the rough wool of her apron. Thunder exploded directly overhead. Edward flinched so hard he nearly threw himself backward. Tilly did the only thing she could think of to drown out the noise. She opened her mouth, and this time she didn't just hum, she sang. It was the same rough, rhythmic Cornish tune she had hummed days ago. Her voice wasn't trained or sweet. It was husky, grounded, and loud enough to cut through the roar of the wind. The tide pulls deep, the water sleeps, the herring boats are gone to weep. Hold the line, hold the mast. The dark will break, the storm will pass. She rocked them back and forth. The rhythm of the song matched the rocking. It was an anchor. A steady, repetitive heartbeat in a room full of chaos. The cliff is steep, the shadows creep. But safe in the harbour, my boys will sleep. She sang it over and over, feeling the vibration of her own chest transferring into the boys. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the rigid tension in Theodore's spine began to ease. Edward's tiny fists uncurled from the fabric of her apron. They were still shaking, but they were breathing. Tilly closed her eyes, entirely focused on the boys, singing the next verse. She didn't hear the nursery door creak open. She didn't hear the heavy footsteps stop dead in the center of the room. "Where did you learn that?" The voice was a jagged rasp of pure, raw fury. Tilly gasped, her eyes flying open. She looked up. Standing in the candlelight, looking like a demon summoned from the dark, was Nathaniel, the Duke of Ashbourne. His black hair was plastered to his forehead with rain, his chest heaving. His eyes were locked on Tilly, wide and feral. Tilly froze, her arms still wrapped tightly around the boys. She couldn't speak. "I said." The Duke stepped forward, his voice rising above the wind, vibrating with a desperate, terrifying anger. "Where did you learn that song?" My mother, Your Grace," Tilly stammered, shrinking back against the wall. "She was a fishwife, in Cornwall. It's just an old shanty." Nathaniel stared at her. The anger in his face fractured, shattering into a look of such profound agony that Tilly had to look away. He swayed on his feet, lifting a trembling hand to his face. "Catherine," he whispered. The name sounded like glass breaking in his throat. Catherine used to sing it. Her father was the magistrate in Truro. She sang it to them. Every night. Tilly's breath hitched. She looked down at the boys in her lap. Theodore was staring up at his father. For the first time in 8 months, the boy wasn't looking at a ghost. He was looking at a man who was crying. Nathaniel dropped to his knees on the hard wooden floor, right there in the dirt and the dust, oblivious to his status, oblivious to everything but the echo of his dead wife in the room. Edward shifted in Tilly's arms. The 6-year-old pulled his face away from Tilly's apron. He looked at his father, kneeling and broken in the candlelight. Edward opened his mouth. His throat worked, swallowing hard. "Papa," Edward croaked. The sound was tiny, rusty, barely more than a breath. But in the quiet that followed the thunder, it rang out like a gunshot. The Duke stopped breathing. Tilly stopped breathing. Nathaniel let out a gut-wrenching sob, a sound dragged up from the very bottom of his soul. He didn't hesitate this time. He crawled across the floor, reaching into the cramped space, and pulled both of his sons out of Tilly's arms and into his own chest. He buried his face in their hair, weeping with utter abandon, rocking them exactly as Tilly had done. Tilly sat in the shadows, her empty hands resting in her lap, watching the mausoleum finally begin to crumble. Morning arrived not with a warm glow, but with the flat, grey light characteristic of a Yorkshire autumn. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a landscape of battered heather and a house holding its breath. Tilly was in the scullery by 5, scrubbing copper pots with sand and vinegar. Her knuckles were raw, her back ached from sleeping on a lumpy mattress, and she was entirely certain she was about to be sacked. You did not touch the Duke's sons, you did not sing in the dead of night, and you certainly did not witness the master of Ashbourne Hall sobbing on the nursery floor. The gossip in the kitchen was already thick enough to choke on. The footman who had been on night watch had heard the wailing. Rumours were mutating by the minute. The Duke had gone mad, the boys were possessed, a ghost had been sighted on the 3rd floor. Tilly kept her head down and scrubbed harder. At 7 o'clock, Mrs. Gable's black shoes appeared in Tilly's peripheral vision. "Wash your hands, Warren," the housekeeper said. Her voice was brittle, devoid of its usual booming authority. "His Grace is in his study. He sent for you." Tilly rinsed the sand from her skin in the freezing basin. She dried her hands on her coarse apron, untied it, and followed Mrs. Gable through the labyrinth of the servants' corridors. The transition from the bare stone of the working house to the rich mahogany and thick Persian carpets of the family wing was always jarring. It felt like crossing a border into a country where the air was heavier, weighed down by money and silence. The study door was heavy oak. Mrs. Gable knocked once, opened it, and gestured for Tilly to enter. Nathaniel was standing by the window. He was not wearing his pristine morning coat. He wore a rumpled white linen shirt, the collar undone, and his hair lacked the severe pomade it usually bore. He looked like a man who had been dragged backward through a hedge, surviving purely on brandy and stubbornness. A half-empty decanter sat on the desk. He didn't turn around immediately. The silence stretched. Tilly stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, waiting for the axe to fall. "Edward asked for toast this morning," Nathaniel said to the glass pane. Tilly blinked. "Pardon, Your Grace." Nathaniel finally turned. The bags under his eyes were bruised purple, but the manic, hollow look that had haunted him for months was gone. It had been replaced by a raw, bleeding exhaustion. "Toast," he repeated, his voice raspy. "With butter. He spoke to Mrs. Gable when she brought the tray. 3 words. He hasn't spoken a single syllable in 241 days. Tilly didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The Duke crossed the room, stopping on the opposite side of his massive desk. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in the cheap wool of her dress, the scuff marks on her boots, the defiant set of her jaw. "What is your name?" he asked. "Matilda Warren, Your Grace. They call me Tilly." "You are not a governess, Matilda Warren." "No, sir, I'm a maid." "Why did you go to the nursery last night?" Tilly met his gaze. She was poor, but she had never been a coward. "Because a storm was tearing the roof off, Your Grace, and 2 children were locked in a room by themselves. It didn't sit right with me." A muscle feathered in Nathaniel's jaw. He looked down at the desk, resting his palms on the polished wood. "My staff follows my orders. I commanded that the boys be left alone. I was advised by physicians in London that treating them like invalids would only prolong their hysteria. With respect, Your Grace, physicians in London don't know shit about what a scared boy needs in a thunderstorm," Tilly said. The words slipped out before she could bite her tongue. She froze. Swearing at a duke was a one-way ticket to the street without a reference. Nathaniel's head snapped up. For a second, utter shock registered on his face. Then, incredibly, a dry, humorless bark of laughter escaped his chest. It was a rusty sound, scraping against the walls of the quiet study. "No," he murmured. "I suppose they don't." He straightened his posture, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Miss Higgins left 4 days ago. We are without a governess." "I can read and write, Your Grace," Tilly said quickly, sensing an opening. "But I don't know French, and I can't play the pianoforte." "I don't care if you can juggle flaming swords, Miss Warren. I care that my 6-year-old son spoke a complete sentence this morning." Nathaniel walked to a heavy iron safe in the corner, unlocked it, and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with the heavy, muffled clink of coinage. "Your wages are quintupled, effective immediately. You will move your things from the scullery to the adjoining room in the nursery. You answer to no one in this house but me." Tilly stared at the pouch. It was more money than her father had made in 3 years on the docks. "Your Grace, I don't—" "Take it," he commanded, the edge returning to his voice. It wasn't anger, it was desperation masking itself as authority. "Sing the song, keep the fire lit, do whatever you did in the dark last night. Just keep them breathing. Can you do that?" Tilly looked at the broken man standing before her. She picked up the pouch. It was heavy, cold, and entirely real. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I can do that." The transition was brutal. Tilly's sudden elevation from a floor-scrubbing nobody to the untouchable head of the nursery sent shockwaves through Ashbourne Hall. The kitchen staff stopped speaking when she walked in to fetch the boys' meals. Mrs. Gable treated her with a cold, terrifying politeness that was far worse than her previous tyranny. Tilly ignored them. She had work to do. The first thing she did was open the nursery windows. The room smelled of stale air, lavender wax, and repressed trauma. She threw the heavy sashes wide, letting the biting autumn wind scour the room. The boys sat on the rug, watching her warily. Theodore had positioned himself slightly in front of Edward, his default setting. "Right," Tilly said, clapping the dust from her hands. She marched over to the perfectly organized shelves. She grabbed a wooden soldier, a painted top, and a fistful of blocks, and dumped them unceremoniously onto the center of the rug. They clattered loudly. Theodore flinched. Edward stared. "We are done sitting like statues," Tilly announced. She dropped to her knees on the floor, sitting cross-legged. She wasn't wearing a corset. She had discarded the stiff, restrictive garment that morning, opting for mobility over modesty. She picked up the wooden top and spun it. It whirred aggressively across the floor, crashing into a table leg. "Your turn," she said, pointing at Theodore. Theodore didn't move. He looked at the top, then at Tilly. Tilly didn't push. She simply sat there, picked up a block, and started building a wildly unstable tower. She hummed a different tune today, a fast, jaunty jig. She let the tower fall. Crash. Edward jumped, but this time his eyes followed the tumbling blocks. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he reached out a pale hand and picked up a red square. He looked at Tilly. She gave him a short, approving nod and went back to building. It took 3 days for the silence to truly break. It happened in the gardens. Tilly had bundled them into heavy wool coats and marched them out the back doors, ignoring the scandalized gasp of the footman at the sight of the Duke's sons dragging their boots through the wet grass. She led them to a patch of soft, rain-soaked earth near the edge of the woods. "What are we doing?" Theodore asked. His voice was hoarse, cracking from disuse, but it was there. "We are finding worms," Tilly said, matter-of-factly. She grabbed a stick and jammed it into the mud, prying up a clump of dirt. Theodore stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "We are gentlemen. Gentlemen do not dig in the mud. Gentlemen who don't dig in the mud are boring," Tilly countered. She snapped the stick in half and handed him a piece. "Dig." For a long moment, Theodore just held the stick. He looked at the pristine cuffs of his coat. Then a tiny rebellious spark lit in his dark eyes. He dropped to his knees. He dug. An hour later, they were filthy. Edward had mud smeared across his cheek, and Theodore was holding a fat, wriggling earthworm with a look of disgusted triumph. "Look," Edward whispered, pointing at the worm. "I see it," Theodore said, a grin threatening to break through his serious facade. "What in God's name is going on here?" The voice cracked over the lawn like a whip. Tilly turned to see the Duke striding towards them, his boots devouring the distance. He was in his riding clothes, a riding crop tapping nervously against his thigh. He looked horrified. Theodore immediately dropped the worm. The boys scrambled to their feet, the spark dying instantly in their eyes. They snapped into their rigid, statue-like posture, their muddy hands glued to their sides. Nathaniel stopped a few feet away. He looked at the mud on their coats, the dirt under their fingernails. His chest heaved. He opened his mouth, likely to shout for Mrs. Gable, likely to fire Tilly on the spot. Tilly stood up, wiping her hands on her skirt. She stepped directly between the Duke and his sons. "We are studying nature, Your Grace," Tilly said loudly, locking eyes with him. She shot him a look that clearly screamed, "Do not ruin this." Nathaniel's mouth clicked shut. He looked at Tilly's defiant glare. He looked past her to his sons, who were trembling, terrified of his reaction. He saw the mud. But for the first time, he also saw the colour in Edward's cheeks. The riding crop stopped tapping against his thigh. He swallowed hard, the sharp line of his Adam's apple bobbing. He was completely out of his depth, a man who knew how to manage vast estates and political alliances, but had no idea how to speak to his own flesh and blood. He took a slow, deep breath. He forced his shoulders to drop. "Nature," Nathaniel repeated. His voice was stiff, unnatural. "Yes," Tilly said, not giving an inch. "Lord Theodore found a very impressive worm." Nathaniel looked at Theodore. The 8-year-old was staring at his boots, waiting for the reprimand. A worm," the Duke forced out. He took a hesitant step forward, stopping beside Tilly. He looked down at the muddy grass. Did you keep it, Theodore?" Theodore looked up, shocked. He hesitated, then pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at the ground. It crawled away, Papa." "Papa." The word struck Nathaniel like a physical blow. He swayed slightly, his eyes shining with unshed moisture. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He wanted to touch them, but he was terrified of breaking them further. "Well," Nathaniel managed, his voice thick. We have a very fine estate for worms. Carry on, Miss Warren." He turned and walked back towards the house. His stride was less commanding, a little more human. Tilly let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She turned back to the boys. "Right," she said, picking up her stick. "Who wants to find a beetle?" Winter arrived early, wrapping Ashbourne Hall in a thick blanket of snow that muted the outside world. Inside, the frost was beginning to thaw. The boys were talking. Not constantly, and rarely above a murmur, but the oppressive silence had fractured. Edward had developed a habit of following Tilly like a small shadow, clutching the hem of her apron while she stoked the fires. Theodore was reading aloud again, stumbling over the harder words, but refusing to let Tilly help him. The Duke, however, remained a problem. Nathaniel had begun to visit the nursery more frequently. Instead of standing in the doorway like the grim reaper, he would come in and sit in the armchair in the corner. But he never joined them on the floor. He sat there, a dark, brooding presence, watching them play with a mixture of intense longing and absolute terror. He was paralyzed by his own grief, desperate to bridge the gap, but completely incapable of taking the first step. Tilly watched this tragic pantomime day after day, her frustration mounting. You couldn't parent from an armchair. The breaking point came 3 weeks before Christmas. Tilly was leading the boys down the grand staircase for their daily constitutional walk in the long gallery. As they passed the second-floor landing, a door that was usually firmly shut stood slightly ajar. A maid must have been in to dust and failed to latch it properly. It was the Duchess's private sitting room. Tilly didn't realize what it was until Theodore stopped dead in his tracks. His hand went slack in hers. He stepped toward the crack in the door, pushing it wider. The room was preserved like a tomb. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, but an oil painting above the mantelpiece remained uncovered. It was Catherine. She was beautiful, vibrant, with the same dark hair and pale skin as her sons, laughing at the painter with a sprig of heather in her hand. Theodore stepped into the room. "Lord Theodore, no," Tilly said softly, stepping after him. "We shouldn't be in here." "That's Mama!" Edward whispered, his voice trembling. He grabbed Tilly's skirt, hiding his face in the fabric. Theodore didn't cry. He walked toward a small, delicate writing desk near the window. Sitting on top of it was a silver hairbrush. He reached out with a shaking hand to touch it. "What are you doing?" The roar echoed down the hallway, shaking the dust from the chandelier. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his face pale with a terrifying, white-hot fury. He strode into the room, crossing the floor in 3 massive steps. He grabbed Theodore by the shoulder, spinning the boy away from the desk. "You do not come in here!" Nathaniel shouted, his voice cracking. "This room is locked! You do not touch her things!" Theodore shrank back, terror seizing his small features. He didn't cry out. He immediately reverted. His shoulders locked, his eyes went blank, and the terrifying dead silence fell over him like a shroud. He retreated deep inside his mind, slamming the door shut. "Stop it!" Tilly yelled. She didn't care that he was a duke. She didn't care about the money. She lunged forward, shoving Nathaniel's hand away from Theodore's shoulder. She grabbed the boy and pulled him behind her, shielding him with her own body. "Look at him!" Tilly shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Theodore. "Look at what you're doing!" Nathaniel froze, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He looked at Theodore, seeing the empty, hollow stare that had returned in a fraction of a second. The anger drained out of the Duke, replaced by a horror so profound it seemed to buckle his knees. Nathaniel stammered, stepping back. "I didn't mean, You lock her away like a secret," Tilly snapped, her voice trembling with adrenaline and rage. "You lock this room. You lock away her name. You act like if you don't speak of her, it didn't happen. They are children. They don't understand why their mother is gone, and they don't understand why their father hates them for looking like her." "I don't hate them!" Nathaniel roared, the sound tearing from his throat. Tears suddenly spilled over his lower lashes, tracking through the stress lines on his face. "I love them. They are all I have left. But every time I look at them, I see her bleeding in the dirt. I couldn't lift the wood, Matilda. I couldn't lift the carriage off her. I tried. I tore my hands to the bone, and she died looking at me." He collapsed into a dust-covered chair, burying his face in his large hands. He didn't weep silently. He sobbed, the ugly, violent sound of a man who had held back the tide for nearly a year and was finally drowning. Edward whimpered from behind Tilly. Tilly stood there, breathing heavily, her anger dissolving into a deep, aching pity. She turned around and knelt in front of Theodore. She took his cold, rigid hands in hers and rubbed them. "Theodore," she said softly. "Theodore, look at me." He blinked. The blankness wavered. "Your father isn't angry at you," she murmured, loud enough for Nathaniel to hear. "He's angry at the carriage. He's angry at the world because it took your mother. He's forgotten how to be brave." Nathaniel slowly lowered his hands. His face was a ruin of grief. He looked at Tilly, kneeling on the floor in her plain wool dress, holding the pieces of his shattered family together, with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn grit. He slipped out of the chair and dropped to his knees on the carpet. It was the second time Tilly had seen him on his knees. He didn't grab the boys this time. He crawled forward slowly, stopping a foot away. He looked at Theodore, then at Edward. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel whispered. His voice was raw, stripped of all titles and authority. I am so sorry. I was wrong to lock the door. I was wrong to yell. I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe. Do you miss her, too?" Theodore stared at him. The 8-year-old swallowed hard. A single tear broke loose, cutting a clean line down his dusty cheek. He nodded. Nathaniel held out his hand, palm up. He didn't force it. He waited. Theodore looked at the large, trembling hand. Then, with a small, choked sob, the boy launched himself forward. He collided with his father's chest, burying his face in Nathaniel's neck. Edward followed a second later, wrapping his arms around his father's waist. Nathaniel crushed them to him, burying his face in their hair, weeping openly in the center of the Duchess's shrine. Tilly stood up slowly. She felt an unexpected tightness in her own throat. She backed away towards the door, intending to give them privacy. This was their moment. She was just the maid who had opened the lock. "Matilda." Tilly paused in the doorway. Nathaniel looked up from his sons. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face wet, but the crushing, suffocating darkness that had surrounded him for months had finally cracked. Light was bleeding in. "Don't go," the Duke said quietly. It wasn't an order. It was a request. Tilly looked at the three of them, tangled together on the floor of the ruined room. She nodded slowly, stepped back inside, and quietly closed the door behind her. Healing did not come like a sudden sunrise. It came like pulling a heavy cart out of a deep ditch, inching forward in the mud, slipping backward, cursing the rain, and pushing again. By the second week of December, Ashbourne Hall was no longer a tomb. The heavy velvet drapes in the drawing rooms had been pulled back, exposing the faded silk wallpaper to the harsh, grey Yorkshire light. The silence that had once suffocated the corridors was broken by irregular, jarring sounds. A dropped plate, a door slamming, the rapid, thumping footfalls of a 6-year-old running down a carpeted hall. To the senior staff, it was anarchy. To Tilly, it was survival. She did not coddle the boys. She treated them with the same pragmatic bluntness she had used on the stray dogs in the Cornwall alleys. If they scraped a knee, she cleaned it with iodine, ignored their dramatic wincing, and sent them back to play. If they fought over a wooden toy, she took the toy away and gave them both a rag to polish the brass fenders until they apologized. They thrived on it. The strict, unyielding boundaries of Tilly's discipline gave them a safe, predictable framework to exist within. They knew exactly where they stood with her. There were no hidden landmines of grief, no sudden, terrifying, emotional withdrawals. Tilly was a fixed point, a brick wall. Nathaniel was a different matter entirely. The Duke was trying. He was trying so hard it was physically painful to watch. He had ceased his ghost-like wanderings and made a concerted effort to be present, but he was a man who had spent his entire adult life being deferred to. He knew how to command a room of politicians. He had no idea how to speak to an 8-year-old who was crying because his wooden boat wouldn't float in the tin bath. Tilly watched him from the periphery, her cynicism acting as a shield against the unexpected tug of sympathy in her chest. One afternoon, a week before Christmas, the boys were playing in the grand foyer. It was a cavernous space of white marble and sweeping staircases, completely unsuitable for children. Theodore and Edward were sliding across the polished floor in their wool socks, laughing as they collided with the heavy mahogany wainscoting. Nathaniel emerged from his study. He carried a stack of ledgers under his arm, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He stepped into the foyer just as Edward took a running slide. The 6-year-old lost his balance, his feet flying out from under him. He crashed hard into a pedestal holding a towering Ming Dynasty porcelain vase. The vase wobbled, teetered, and fell. It hit the marble floor with a catastrophic explosion of blue and white shards. The laughter died instantly. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute and terrifying. It was the old silence, the dead silence. Edward scrambled backward, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with horror. He looked at the shattered remains of a priceless artifact, and then he looked up at his father. Theodore immediately ran across the floor, planting himself firmly between Edward and the Duke, his small fists clenched at his sides. They braced themselves for the explosion. Nathaniel froze. He looked at the broken vase. The ledgers in his hand slowly slipped from his grip, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Tilly stepped out of the shadows of the servant corridor. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She didn't say a word. She just watched the Duke. This was the test. Nathaniel stared at the shards. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He looked at his two sons, huddled together, waiting for the wrath of the master of Ashbourne. He saw the terror in their eyes. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He stepped over his dropped ledgers, walked over to the shattered vase, and knelt down. He picked up a piece of the porcelain. "Well," Nathaniel said. His voice was a little rough, slightly unsteady. "I always hated this vase. Your mother said it looked like a bloated fish." Theodore blinked, stunned. Edward peered out from behind his brother. Nathaniel looked at the boys, forcing the tension out of his shoulders. He tossed the shard back onto the pile. It clattered loudly. It seems we are in need of a new decorative piece for the foyer. Perhaps a large rock from the garden, or a very fat badger. Edward let out a sudden, involuntary snort. Nathaniel smiled. It wasn't a broad, joyful smile. It was small, fragile, and deeply tired. But it was real. He held out his hand. Come along. Let us find Mrs. Gable and confess our crimes before she discovers the mess and hangs us all from the bell tower. Theodore slowly unclenched his fists. He reached out and took his father's hand. Edward took the other. As the three of them walked away from the wreckage, Tilly sagged against the door frame, letting out a long, shaky breath. He was learning. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, Tilly was sitting by the nursery fire, mending a tear in one of Edward's shirts. The door creaked open. Nathaniel stood on the threshold, holding 2 glasses and a bottle of expensive, dark, amber brandy. Tilly stood up immediately, smoothing her apron. Your Grace, sit down, Matilda, he said quietly, walking into the room. He poured 2 measures of the liquor and handed one to her. Tilly looked at the crystal glass in her hand. It cost more than she made in a month. She sat back down in her wooden chair. Nathaniel took the armchair opposite her, stretching his long legs out towards the hearth. He stared into the flames for a long time. I was going to shout at them, he confessed, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the wood. When the vase broke, my chest seized and I was going to scream at them for making a mess, for making noise. He took a heavy swallow of the brandy. It is a terrifying thing, Matilda, to realize your default instinct is to break your own children. But you didn't, Tilly said. She didn't offer him empty comfort. She took a sip of the brandy. It burned violently down her throat, leaving a trail of fire in her chest. You stopped. That's what matters. Is it? He looked over at her. The firelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his face. I am a duke. I command hundreds of tenants, vast estates, and political influence in London. Yet, when I look at my 6-year-old son, I am utterly paralyzed. I don't know what I'm doing. No one does, Your Grace, Tilly said flatly. Rich or poor, my mother used to say that having a child was like walking through a dark room full of furniture with no candle. You're going to stub your toe, you're going to curse, and you're going to break things. You just have to keep walking. Nathaniel let out a short, quiet laugh. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Your mother was a wise woman. She was a fishwife who died of a preventable cough because she couldn't afford a doctor. Tilly corrected, her cynicism flaring up, sharp and defensive. Wisdom doesn't pay the rent. Nathaniel looked at her, truly absorbing the bitter edge in her voice. He didn't patronize her with an apology. He simply nodded. No, it doesn't. They sat in silence for a while. Just a maid and a duke, separated by an unbridgeable gulf of class and circumstance, yet anchored to the same 2 boys sleeping in the next room. I have ordered a carriage to fetch pine branches tomorrow, Nathaniel said eventually. For Christmas decorations, the boys, they used to enjoy that. They will enjoy it again, Tilly said. Will you come with us? Tilly hesitated. Her job was in the nursery. Riding in the Duke's carriage was crossing a dangerous line. The staff would talk, the house would judge. She looked at Nathaniel's eyes. He wasn't asking as an employer. He was asking as a man who was still afraid of the dark, looking for someone to hold a candle. I'll fetch my heavy coat, Tilly said. The piece lasted exactly 5 days. It shattered not from within, but from without, in the form of a black, iron-wheeled carriage tearing up the gravel drive of Ashbourne Hall. Tilly was in the nursery, teaching Theodore how to cheat at cards, a purely practical skill in her opinion, when the heavy thud of the front knocker echoed all the way up to the 3rd floor. 30 minutes later, Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway. Her face was the colour of old chalk. Miss Warren, the housekeeper said, her voice tight. Dress the boys in their formal morning suits. Brush their hair. Bring them to the drawing room immediately. Tilly frowned. laying down her cards. "Morning suits. They haven't worn those in a month. They're too tight." "Do not argue with me, girl," Mrs. Gable hissed, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder. "Lady Agatha has arrived." Tilly had heard the whispers in the kitchen. Lady Agatha was Nathaniel's aunt. She was a woman carved from granite and steeped in the rigid, unforgiving social codes of the aristocracy. She had practically raised Nathaniel after his own parents died, and she viewed any deviation from strict societal norms as a personal insult. Tilly didn't argue. She knew the power dynamics of the world she lived in. She wrestled the boys into the stiff black woolen suits. The heavy fabric immediately changed their demeanor. Theodore went quiet, his shoulders tensing. Edward began to chew on his thumbnail, a nervous habit he had abandoned weeks ago. Tilly led them down the sweeping staircase, her hand resting reassuringly on Edward's shoulder. The drawing room felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. Lady Agatha sat in the center of a velvet sofa. She wore black silk that rustled like dry leaves when she moved. She had a sharp, predatory nose and eyes like chips of flint. Nathaniel stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. The relaxed, tentative father Tilly had seen yesterday was gone. The Duke had returned. "Come forward, boys," Lady Agatha commanded. Her voice was sharp, carrying the aristocratic drawl that made every word sound like a judgment. Theodore and Edward walked forward mechanically. They stopped a respectful distance away and bowed. "Good God, Nathaniel," Agatha said, looking them up and down through a silver lorgnette. They look like wild animals. The younger one has mud on his boots. In the drawing room." "They were playing outside, Aunt," Nathaniel said stiffly. "Playing. They are in mourning for their mother, the Duchess. They should be at their studies, or in quiet reflection, not rolling in the muck like common labourers." Agatha lowered her glasses and snapped her gaze to Tilly, who was standing quietly near the door. "And who is this?" "This is Matilda Warren," Nathaniel said. His voice was guarded. "She is overseeing the nursery." "Overseeing?" Agatha's eyebrows shot up into her hairline. "A scullery maid? I can smell the lye soap from here. Have you lost your senses, Nathaniel? Where is Miss Higgins?" "Miss Higgins left, Aunt." "Miss Warren has been highly effective. The boys have shown great improvement." "Improvement?" Agatha scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "They are practically vibrating with indiscipline. They need structure, Nathaniel. They need a firm hand to remind them of their station and their duty to their mother's memory. It is a disgrace to Catherine to let them run wild while she rots in the ground." Theodore flinched violently at the words. He stepped back, bumping into Edward. Edward let out a tiny, choked gasp. "Aunt Agatha, please," Nathaniel warned, his voice dropping in warning. But Agatha wasn't finished. She stood up, the black silk rustling aggressively. She walked over to Theodore and stared down at him. "Stand up straight, boy. Do you think your mother would be proud to see you slouching? Do you think she died so you could play in the dirt with the help?" Theodore's face went completely blank. The hollow, dead look that Tilly had spent weeks fighting rushed back into his eyes. He stopped breathing. He retreated into the fortress of his own mind, slamming the heavy iron doors shut. Edward burst into tears. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there shaking, tears streaming down his face in absolute silence. Tilly couldn't take it. She didn't care about the Duke. She didn't care about the money. She saw 2 children being mentally beaten by an old woman who weaponized grief for control. Tilly crossed the room in 3 strides. She ignored the shocked gasp of the aunt, pushed past the heavy silk skirts, and grabbed both boys by their hands. "We are going back upstairs," Tilly said, her voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. "Oh, how dare you!" Lady Agatha shrieked, her face flushing a mottled purple. "Unhand them this instant, you insolent, dirty little creature!" Tilly turned on her heel, pulling the boys behind her. She looked Lady Agatha dead in the eye. "I might be dirty, my lady, but at least I know the difference between mourning the dead and torturing the living." The room went deathly still. Agatha turned slowly to Nathaniel. Her finger was shaking as she pointed at Tilly. Throw her out this second without a reference, or I will write to every house in Yorkshire and see to it that you are socially ruined for letting a feral maid usurp your authority. Nathaniel looked at Agatha. He looked at the boys, who were clinging to Tilly's skirts in silent terror. He looked at Tilly. The Duke's face closed off. The mask slammed back into place. "Matilda," Nathaniel said. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of the man who had hired her. "Go to your room. Pack your things." Tilly felt a cold, heavy stone drop in the pit of her stomach. The cynicism she relied on flared up, a protective shell against the sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She had been a fool. She had forgotten her place. The aristocracy closed ranks. They always closed ranks. "Yes, Your Grace," Tilly said flatly. She turned and walked out of the room. The boys tried to follow her, but Nathaniel stepped forward, grabbing them both by the shoulders, holding them back. Edward finally made a noise. He screamed. It was a jagged, horrific sound of sheer panic. Tilly didn't look back. If she looked back, she would break. She marched up the stairs, went to her small adjoining room, and pulled her canvas satchel from beneath the bed. She didn't have much to pack. 3 cheap dresses, a spare apron, and a wooden comb. She left the velvet pouch of heavy coins on the nightstand. She wasn't a charity case. She had earned her keep, but she wouldn't take his guilt money. 10 minutes later, she walked out the back door into the freezing servants' courtyard. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Snow was beginning to fall, settling on the cobblestones. She pulled her thin shawl tight around her shoulders and started walking down the long gravel drive toward the village. It was over. The mausoleum had claimed them all again. Tilly was a mile down the road when she heard the horses. She didn't stop walking. The wind was biting, whipping her hair across her face and numbing her fingers. The sound of hooves striking the frozen mud grew louder, accompanied by the rattle of heavy carriage wheels. "Matilda, stop!" Tilly kept her head down. It was probably the estate manager sent to make sure she was well off the property. She trudged forward, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. A massive black horse cut across her path, forcing her to halt. Nathaniel swung down from the saddle. He wasn't wearing an overcoat. He was in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his breath ghosting in the freezing air. He looked frantic, his hair wind-blown and his eyes wide. Tilly took a step back, her defenses instantly rising. "I'm off the property, Your Grace. You don't need to run me down." "I told her to leave," Nathaniel said, chest heaving as he closed the distance between them. Tilly blinked, confused. "What?" "Agatha!" Nathaniel gasped, the cold air burning his lungs. "I threw her out. I told her to pack her trunks and never return to Ashbourne Hall. The carriage is being brought around for her right now." Tilly stared at him. The sheer audacity of a duke throwing out his own blood relative over a servant was entirely outside the realm of her understanding. You sent her away? Why did you tell me to pack my things then?" "Because if you had stayed in that room a second longer, she would have torn you to pieces, and I was too frozen to stop her." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure, raw frustration. "I panicked, Matilda. I reverted to what I know, to the rules. But when you walked out and Edward screamed, I saw it. I saw exactly what I was building. I was building a tomb, and I was burying them alive just to keep the peace." He stepped closer. He didn't care that they were standing in the middle of a frozen road. He didn't care about his status. "I cannot do this without you," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. They cannot do this without you. Please, come back." Tilly looked at him. She looked at the desperation in his eyes, stripping away all the wealth, all the titles, leaving just a terrified father standing in the snow. She tightened her grip on her canvas satchel. "If I go back, I don't answer to her. I don't answer to anyone but you, and if they want to dig in the mud, they dig in the mud." "They can dig up the entire estate," Nathaniel said fiercely. "And you don't shut the doors anymore," Tilly demanded, poking a cold finger into his chest. "You don't hide from them when it gets hard. You sit on the floor and you play with them." Nathaniel looked down at her hand resting against his chest. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached up and covered her cold, rough hand with his own. His grip was warm and grounding. "I promise," he whispered. They stood there for a moment in the falling snow. It wasn't a fairy tale declaration of love. It was a pact, a partnership forged in the fires of grief and survival. Tilly slowly pulled her hand back. She gave a curt nod. "Right then. I suppose I should get back. Someone needs to make sure Theodore hasn't fed the new governess to the hounds." Nathaniel let out a shaky breath that turned into a laugh. He reached out and easily took the canvas bag from her shoulder. "My horse can carry both of us, if you trust me." Tilly looked at the massive beast, then at the Duke. "I trust you to not drop me in the snow, Your Grace. Beyond that, the jury is out." When they rode back into the courtyard of Ashbourne Hall, the atmosphere had shifted. Lady Agatha's carriage was gone. The house felt lighter, as if a great physical weight had been lifted from the roof. Tilly walked straight up the back stairs to the nursery. She pushed the door open. The room was warm. The fire was roaring. Theodore and Edward were sitting on the floor in their woolen undershirts, the stiff morning suits discarded in a heap in the corner. When they saw Tilly, they scrambled to their feet. They didn't hesitate. They ran across the room and slammed into her, wrapping their arms around her waist, nearly knocking her backward. Tilly dropped to her knees, hugging them fiercely, burying her face in their hair. The cynical armor she wore finally cracked and fell away, leaving her entirely exposed and entirely okay with it. "I'm here," she murmured, rocking them back and forth. "I'm not going anywhere." Nathaniel stood in the doorway, watching them. He didn't stand in the shadows this time. He stepped into the light, walked over, and sat down on the floor beside them. He reached out and pulled all three of them into his arms. Outside, the Yorkshire wind howled against the limestone walls, a fierce, freezing storm. But inside the nursery, the air was warm. And softly, barely audible over the crackling fire, the Duke of Ashbourne began to sing a rough, off-key Cornish shanty. "Oh, the tide pulls deep, the water sleeps. But safe in the harbour, my boys will sleep." And for the first time in nearly a year, Theodore and Edward sang it with him. Grief doesn't disappear, it just changes shape, becoming a room we learn to live in rather than a door we lock shut. The Ashbourne boys found their voices not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, stubborn rhythm of a Cornish shanty, and the hands of a maid who refused to let them drown in the silence. If you enjoyed this journey of healing, defiance, and finding light in the darkest corners, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves grounded historical drama, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, human storytelling.